You're listening to the Embrace Family Recovery Podcast, a place for real conversations with people who love someone with the disease of addiction. Now here is your host, Margaret Swift Thompson.
Welcome back to the Embrace Family Recovery Podcast. Today, I continue my conversation with my friend and previous guest, William Cope Moyers. He's the author of Broken and has joined us today to talk about life and recovery since publishing Broken in 2006. William's ongoing journey of recovery is captured in his new book, Broken Open. And today he talks about his passion to carry on his message. I'm grateful for this second book and all it will do to offer people insight to the journey of recovery.
The Embrace Family Recovery Podcast.
Speaking to the core of you, the one that was being eaten alive by the shame of the disease when you were rising to success in your book Broken and struggling with your secret addiction to opiates, how could you leave it there?
Right. I couldn't.
I don't think I could, because it would eat me alive to know that that's where people thought it ended and I'm still seen in that light. And this next light is going to be more beautiful, I'm guessing, and more hopeful for people because you are willing to be honest and open and share that it hasn't been this trajectory uphill. It's the nature of this disease.
And the nature of this journey from the disease to the rest of life. Remember, for people like me, my problem is less alcohol and other drugs. My problem is more about living my life without alcohol and other drugs. I've always said the only thing more difficult than living life sober is living life drunk or stoned. So if you take away the drunk and the stoned part, life is really hard. I mean, it's good, but it's hard. Mm-hmm. And I owe it to people like us from families like ours. I owe it to be able to explain that dynamic of what it's like to go through life after you've left the substances behind, or when you run into them again, or after you have healed from a previous failed relationship to the challenges of a new failed relationship. That's life. And the recovery journey is really all about living this life and striving to be a better human being. I have come to understand, listen, sobriety is really important for a lot of us. And I used to define my sobriety from the date of October the 12th of 1994, when, as I wrote in Broken, I came out of the crack house in Atlanta, Georgia. I came out of there that day and my father said, "I hate you." And I said, "I hate me too." And that was my bottom. And I wrote about that. And I started to count my sobriety date from October 12th of 94. When I had this run-in with the pain meds, I realized that my sobriety date had been interrupted, but my commitment to recovery actually remained the same. If it hadn't, I would have given up. And so now, Margaret, I see my recovery journey from when I took those first steps out of the crack house, not in October of 1994, but 5 years earlier, in August of 1989, when I came out of the crack house in Harlem, was locked up in a psychiatric ward in New York City for 3 weeks, and then was put on an airplane on a one-way ticket to Hazelland in 1989. I have seen that my recovery journey, frankly, for me, there is more to recovery than sobriety.
Right.
And for me, it's that commitment to be a better person, that commitment to be free from substances, yes, but even when I'm tangled in them, to continue to strive to be a better human being. And so now I see my recovery date as August the 5th of 89.
You shared earlier the kind of the collateral fallout from telling your story on that stage on a work level. What I would really like to focus a little time on is the collateral damage that we all know to be true of the trust being hurt in our families when there is a return to use. The families go back to almost square one emotionally, like, really, even though they have known you. So if you're willing to talk about that, when the family, the people you love the most, found out about this part of your story, talk us through a little bit about what happened and how that has also repaired, restored, healed. What's that look like?
Well, and that's a tough question in a lot of ways because it speaks to the very intimacy of these relationships that I've had, but it's a fair question. So the most important relationship that was affected by that was to the woman that I'm married to now, Nell Hurley, who's a woman in long-term recovery, 25 some odd years. She's 10 years younger than me. We met in 2009 when she came up to my front door in St. Paul asking for help for a friend of hers, and was told by her sponsor to come find me because I had written this book called Broken. And I was divorced at that time. So she came up to me, we started a relationship. And when she found out about all the things that had occurred or had not occurred during that time that I write about, she said, she stopped me on the street one day. We were in New York City. And she said, William, you owe me an apology.
Mm.
And I was like, yeah, I do. And I didn't try to mitigate it. I didn't try to explain it away. Even though I felt like I could have probably explained it away in some way, I had to honor her sentiment in that moment and not say, yes, but, or maybe no, but I just said, yeah. And so I know right where I was standing on the Upper West Side. And when I said, yeah, no, you're right. I apologize for those times. I was honest by omission.
Mm.
Or I was dishonest without explanation. And so she accepted that. My kids, I just got an amazing email from my oldest son, Henry, yesterday, who wrote me after he read this book. I sent it to him last week, and it's just so beautiful. I can't do it any justice. But he was away during that time, so he didn't have any implications per se, nor did my middle son, Thomas. My daughter, Nancy, who is a therapist now in New York City, she graduated from Columbia a year ago and is also very open about being in recovery differently than I do for the last 5 years. She was at home during that period, and so it's helped her to fill in some of the blanks. She hasn't asked me anything that I haven't been willing to share with her. She sort of knew it during that time. And candidly, she was also struggling. That was that was about the time she was struggling herself. So, Margaret, I was very fortunate that I had a lot of recovery capital. I had a lot of support around me so that when I struggled like I did, while there were issues of honesty or dishonesty, which are, of course, are always paramount to a relationship or the lack of a relationship, while I had some of those issues, the collateral damage, if you will, was not as grave as it could have been under different dynamics. That said, I have said to all three of my children and some of the other people that are mentioned in the book, if you have any questions about anything that I write about, come to me and let's talk. And I have found, and I think you would agree on this, that the best way we can handle our relationships is just to be honest. It's hard sometimes, particularly for people like me, but what better way to remedy a broken relationship or a hurt relationship, a bruised relationship, than just to be honest?
To also be open to conversation.
Yeah, you gotta be,
Well, and I appreciate very much your candor with your story about Nell saying, I need an apology, that you felt that truth, that yes, that's true. And then the disease implication of, well, I could probably figure a way around this and say that. Like, that honesty is so important for family members to hear, that even with collateral from recovery, even with capital, as you call it, from recovery, even with the knowledge and experience you have, that voice still does show up. But as we're in our work of recovery, the saner, healthier, more well voice can prevail. That's that balance that I think each of us do as we journey through life.
Yes. And again, it goes back to knowing that how we used to do things never really worked out. And so why continue to repeat them? And there were a lot of times when I would apologize for relapsing again and again. And after a while, it rung hollow with my
Right.
family to the point where I realized that the only apology or the only way I can make an amends to them is just to try to stay sober or stay in recovery. And that tends to work better. So actions always speak louder than words. I believe that. And yet there are times when, especially the family member just needs to be able to express what they need to express and then know that you have heard them.
Yeah.
I could have pushed back against Nell saying I needed an apology. I could have said, well, you should have known, or didn't you remember this? I was just like, no, you're right. I need to make an apology. And I think when it comes to the healing process, particularly with families that have been affected by addiction, even if we think we've got a good excuse or a good reason for something, sometimes it's just best to keep our mouths shut and just listen and just honor that person's need.
Absolutely. It's also getting out of our own way and our own codependency in a different way of me expecting that I know what someone else needs to be okay. That's not my job. That's their job.
So I want to say something about that because it goes back to these kids I've got. These are remarkably resilient 3 children so Allison made some decisions and went back to Bermuda for a while. And so I became a single dad of these 3 kids in St. Paul, where I lived for a long time and living still. And we went on our way. And we were a pretty tight group during those years. But my kids are still my kids. I mean, they're still teenagers, right? So one day, one of them came to me and asked for help and got help and went their way, which was different. Then another one came and asked for help and got help and went their way. And then the other one came and asked for help and went their way. What I have learned through that whole experience is that I have to get out of the way sometimes. I have to be present when my family members ask for help. I have to help them get to where that help can be. But then I hate to say let go, but maybe that's the term, but I have to then step to the side and let them go the way they're going to go. Because as I said earlier, in my case, all 3 of my children are on their paths of well-being. They do it differently than I do, but they're doing it. And I have to honor that. And it's worked out. It also frees me, if you will, or lessens the burden that I have of having to carry around somebody else's stuff.
I think it is letting go. So my language would be, and I know letting go has a lot of challenges for many people because it feels like abandonment, which it is not. It's the letting go of being their higher power to discern what is right for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Letting go so that I can breathe while they learn the lessons they have to learn to stand on their feet and be the person they get to be. And it's tough, but I think that it's so important to reiterate that. Something you said earlier that I think is also good to go back to is when you took that opiate from the dentist appropriately, that first time, that sense of, I think any one of us knows that, whether we're addict or not. We probably profoundly know it, whether we're someone who's in recovery from some addiction. What have you found that gives you that? Because life still happens.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I have found is just a little bit more wisdom to know that I'm going to continue to feel that way from time to time, that sort of being stressed out or pressed for time or having too much on my plate. And that's okay. And that if I continue to do my meditations and exercise and get enough sleep, which I've been doing a lot of lately as I get ready for this very arduous book tour and also the 75th anniversary celebration weekend for Hazel and Betty Ford. There's a lot going on. What I have found is I just need to do those things to sort of restore my recovery capital. I have what I call an IRA, an individual recovery account. A lot of people think of an IRA as being, like an individual retirement account, but I have an IRA, which is all about all the resources that I put into my recovery. And I just make sure I put a lot in there.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I will say I'm not as hard on myself anymore like I used to be. I do say no. In fact, just before you and I got onto this conversation, I had to say no to something later on this afternoon. And guess what? The world didn't end. And here you and I are, and everything's going to be fine. Some of that comes with age, some of that comes with wisdom, some of that comes from lived experience. And certainly on this journey of recovery, all of us have the lived experience, whether we're the addict, the alcoholic, the family member, whatever. So I've got enough in my individual recovery account to know that I can deal with the things I have to deal with going forward. And some of that means saying no. And that is a hard thing to do for some of us, particularly those of us who are people pleasers or just want everybody to be happy with us and so on. To say no, I think, is one of the great gifts that we can give ourselves.
And the people that we say no to often, it's a gift we give them.
You know what? I'm so glad you said that, because after I said what I said, I said, oh, I should have, and you nailed it. Sometimes they just want us to say no because they need to do things their way, or they need to do things on their timeline. And giving them permission by saying, no, I'm not going to do this or do that, I think is a gift in its own right.
This podcast is made possible by listeners like you.
Hi, everyone. I am Margaret Swift Thompson of the Embrace Family Recovery podcast. I wanted to jump on in this bumper and just share how grateful I am that each and every one of you has chosen to listen, review, share this podcast. My intention is that anyone impacted by the family disease of addiction will get the opportunity to feel less alone and understand more about their journey and the disease with which they grapple one day at a time. If you would be so kind as to follow, subscribe, whether it be to the podcast platform or YouTube, if you would share with at least 3 friends this episode or any episode of the podcast. And also, if you have not written a review of the value you get from this podcast, please do so. That means so much to me and helps more people out there who won't know about this podcast without us doing this get an opportunity to find the support they so deserve. I appreciate you, and I thank you. Take care of you.
You're listening to the Embrace Family Recovery podcast. Can you relate to what you're hearing? Never miss a show by hitting the subscribe button. Now back to the show.
A couple things that I want to just touch on before we conclude this. And one of them is you brought up nobody should live in pain, even a person with a substance use disorder. Your pain was very much part of this chapter change in the storyline of the book. How are you with pain? How do you manage pain? How is life in that respect?
Yeah, I've developed a phobia around dentists. It's a terrible thing because they're really important, particularly as you get older. I've been lucky that I haven't had any chronic pain. I've had some acute pain. I had a surgery, a spine surgery. I had an ablation a couple of years ago. When I know I'm going to need opiate pain relief, I go through my addiction doc in Minneapolis, who writes the script and then monitors the dispersing of it. The lesson that I've learned is that even though I knew and heard stories how you should always give your pain medications over to you, to your spouse or somebody in your household or a trusted friend, a mentor, whatever, didn't do that time. And now I know you got to do that.
Right.
But I've been very lucky that I haven't had that kind of pain. And when I have had it, I'm good about knowing what to do with it. I also know this, and this is sort of a sub theme of the book, even though it's not in the book per se. I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 1959, and the baby boom generation was 46 to 64, 1964. And so there's thousands of us coming of age, of older age, as baby boomers now. Some of us came of age as baby boomers and found recovery during that process, which is a wonderful thing. But we're getting older, and whether it's chronic pain, acute pain from, getting a knee replaced or arthritis, whether it's the loss of a spouse or retirement, there are a lot of challenges that come with getting older. And I think we're in a frontier in this world of treatment and recovery where we've got to really recognize that older adults are going to have a lot of special needs, and their families, because families are going to be sort of having to deal with mom or dad or grandma or grandpa as we get older.
I agree. And there are special requirements in caring for people who are older adults with this disease and other illnesses that are debilitating as well. I'm glad to hear that your pain has been manageable. I hear that you dip into your individual recovery account when you face it. I love that. How has it been? Because I remember when Broken came out, and I remember some of the pushback within the recovery community for you being out there talking openly about this. Well, now you're going to this next level of being open about a return to use and a secrecy around the use and all of that. How are you preparing for that, which will come? How have you been dealing with it? Where do you sit with that, William?
Great question. Thank you. Because what I hear in that question is sort of one of your deep talents for self-care, or making sure that this person you're talking to is going to get the self-care that I need to continue on. So thank you for that. I strayed the boundaries of anonymity in Broken. I figured when I wrote that book, I figured if I was going to write about the graphic nature of my illness and all the things that I did under the influence, I owed it to the reader to explain how it was that I was recovering from it. And I've always believed in personal anonymity. I believe in the confidentiality that occurs in treatment programs. Absolutely. But I chose to be public as it relates to the role that 12-step recovery played in my life, because I was public about my addiction. And I didn't get better with magic.
Right. So you were open about the problem and you felt imperative to open about the solution.
The solution, that it's not just a miracle that we get better, that I got better because I got access to treatment 4 times, that I was access to professional counselors who are licensed, and that I have this 12-step program to help me keep walking my walk. I had to write about that. In the new book, I continue along the pathway in explaining that 12-step recovery was very vital to me, but that I could not find in those meetings what I needed to quiet this brain. And I would hope that through my experience, people who are in 12-step groups can realize that there are times when appropriately prescribed anti-craving medications are part of the recovery process, and that's okay too. I've talked about all the other things that I do beyond 12-step recovery. And candidly, I have had a few people say, like I said earlier, well, why, William, would you want to besmirch yourself, or why would you want to knock yourself down? And I was like, well, because I am who I am. I talk about in the book that somebody came up to me and said, oh, William, man, that's a great story. I want to be like you one day. And I said, be careful what you ask for.
Right.
I just, look, Margaret, I'm a human being, and addiction is an illness that ravages human beings. I've been ravaged. My family's been ravaged, but I've been blessed by recovery, access to continued treatments, the very best that medicine can offer, a connection with a higher power that continues to evolve, and the friendships and relationships with people like you and many, many others. So, my story is an open book to the extent that anything I can do to share my journey with people to then help them find hope and healing, that's fine by me.
And I'm so glad you have. I know that the pushback is there. I know that there's resistance. I'm also an open book. And I think that when we look at our children and we look at our families and we look at the people around us, to leave it where you left it, gives hope, gives the truth of the story to that point. I feel like this is even more hopeful, because I think that this next chapter book is much more commonplace to the experience of people with this disease and their families than leaving it at the precipice of that V.
I agree, Margaret. And it was so frustrating to me to not find much in the genre of addiction memoir about decades later. And then, of course, it's so frustrating to me and sad to read about Matthew Perry, who's been in the news of late, and the fact that he died obviously from using again and being sort of enabled, if you will, because for every story of a Matthew Perry, there are stories of other people who've had a recurrence of use but get better again. And we cannot forget that addiction is not a curable illness, at least not yet. And that's true for the addict and the alcoholic, and that's true for the family.
That's
But
right.
that recovery is possible even when the illness comes back. Recovery for the sick person and recovery for the family of the sick person, that you can continue down that road of recovery if you don't give up.
Agreed. And it's ironic that you brought up Matthew Perry, because one of the people that I was thinking of during this conversation was him and his family, whom my heart goes out to, who are left with all of this unknown and trauma and perspectives and opinions and judgments and all of that. So when I see someone like you who has the fortune to continue to tell their story, even through a return to use, I want that for so many more people.
Yes, Margaret, do you know that since I wish I had the list in front of me, but since Broken came out in 06 in hardcover and then paperback in 07, in other words, in all those years that I write about since Broken, we've had people like Prince and Michael Jackson and Tom Petty and Philip Seymour Hoffman and Matthew Perry and
Amy Winehouse
and so many others who had the same illness that I have, some of whom had recovery under their belts, but had a recurrence of use and it killed them. That's a true story, and we need to always honor those stories. But we have to also remember that they had families and that their families can find hope and find reason to continue on their own pathways to recovery, even when we have those sad stories. And then finally, to really recognize that while there is no cure for addiction, there is a solution. And that solution oftentimes means there's going to be a recurrence of use, but it doesn't mean that it has to be the end. It can be just another one of those mileposts that allows people like me to keep walking that walk.
Yeah. How are your parents?
Well, thanks for asking. My father turned 90 in June. My mother turned 89 in May. On my mother's birthday, she fell and was seriously injured. I was there in New York City when it happened. It's been a heck of a 3 or 4 months, but they're stable now.
Good.
My mother is in assisted living. My father's at home a couple blocks away in Manhattan. And in December, if we can get that far, they will mark their 70th wedding anniversary. My mother was 19 and my father was 20 when they got married in 1954. I was born 5 years later. And so what a gift, because, my parents were deeply affected, not just by my substance use issues early on, but we had it in our family. And my parents have always known that by coming to the family program at Hazelden in the fall of 1989, they began their recovery journeys. Mm-hmm. And because of that journey they started 35 years ago, here they are today battling with lots of stuff, but better for the experiences they had in the family program and in their own programs of recovery since.
And how were they with your new book?
Well, they're just reading it right now.
Okay.
Actually, I mailed it to them last week. They had known I was working on it. I originally sold the book to Penguin Random House back in 2018. And then for a lot of reasons, including the pandemic, it just kept getting pushed off. Once my mother was in the hospital for a long time. So I said, I can't get the book done. Then Mark Mishik, our CEO, retired, and we got Joe Lee. And when Dr. Lee came, he started talking in ways that were like, I thought, wow, this book is... what he's talking about is very similar to my own lived experience. And so I decided to take the book back and have Hazelden publish it. The point being that it's taken 6 years to get to it. Bill and Judith, my parents, have known it's coming, but they've had their own issues. So they're just reading it for the first time now. I didn't ask for their counsel.
Wow.
Yeah.
My guess is at the end of the day, there will be all sorts of feelings and emotions, but at the end of the day, they'll be grateful that you have been true to yourself and found your way through this last return to use and are, again, giving of yourself to the rest of the world to see that even though it is not a perfect journey, nor should it be, because we are not perfect, it is a journey that can have hope. And I'm so glad you've done that.
Well, thank you, Margaret. My dad said to me a couple of years ago, he said, son, I'm real proud of you. You've saved more lives in 60 years than I meaning him, have saved in 85 years. And that meant a lot to me because he's been a larger than life figure in a lot of ways over the decades. But I am blessed that I still have both of my parents. And I do believe in my heart of hearts that part of the reason why we are still walking this walk together as the family that we are is because my parents took care of themselves while I took care of myself.
And your children are doing the same. They're taking care of themselves while you take care of you.
Yeah, my oldest son, Henry, is getting married on September the 1st in Seattle. My middle son, Thomas, has been married for a year and a half to a nurse, and he works in the area of fundraising for the blind in Boston. And then my daughter, Nancy, as I mentioned earlier, is graduated from Columbia with her LMSW a year and a half ago and is working as a therapist in Manhattan. All of my children in helping professions. And I think that's been the greatest gift of my own recovery and my family's recovery, which is that we can give back. We can give back and help other people. That's the greatest gift of all of this journey for me, to be able to help other people. There's nothing better.
And I don't know your children other than I had the privilege of meeting your daughter about a year and a half ago now.
Yeah, I
and
remember.
Was absolutely enthralled with who she is as a woman.
Yeah.
And what an amazing journey since I've met her, what I've seen socially of her achievements and stuff and living her truth. And, we get to feel really good about the fact that our children are blossoming.
Yes.
Despite us and because of us.
Despite us and because of us. That is so true. I love the way you say that. And I want to just say something about you too. I remember when I met you and you were at Hazel and Betty Ford, and I always had such a profound respect for your work. It's sort of your innate passion that was really interesting to me. It just sort of came out of you. And even though you moved on, I'm so glad that you're doing what you're doing. And particularly with that emphasis on the family that too often gets neglected or doesn't get the same sort of attention or the resources that the problem person has, but that you're doing this work and making a difference. It's a great gift. And I'm honored that you and I have been together today. So I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you, William. I look forward to this coming out. I look forward to reading it myself. I would be willing to have you on anytime to talk about anything, but I do want to say that humanity is its finest when people are authentic. And I'm so glad the disease did not take you from us, and that you found your solution, and that you are willing to share it with everybody, because I think we need more stories of hope that aren't pretty packages with a bow on top, but are the truth of most of our experiences, which is life is bumpy. And we get a chance to lean into it and work hard at our recovery, or we will be taken. Whether family or the person with the disease, this disease will take us if we let it. And you have chose not to. You have leaned in.
And you have given me the opportunity. And I know that from this podcast, from this conversation, that there will be people out there who will find what they need to ask for help, or to hang on, or to help the other person that they love. So thank you for helping me to carry the message.
Thank you, William. I know many people hear the story of a person entering recovery and wonder how it unfolds. I appreciate, as always, William's courage to share the truth of his journey. Recovery is a day-by-day journey, and there are ups, downs, twists, and turns. And these are important to also share. The main thing about recovery is being willing to continue the journey, one day at a time. Come back next week, where I have a special friend and guest visit us and share his story. You will get an opportunity to hear from Jay, who is a father, and his story will deeply touch you. I want to thank my guest for their courage and vulnerability in sharing parts of their story. Please find resources on my website, embracefamilyrecovery.com. This is Margaret Swift Thompson. Until next time, please take care of you.